This episode of Lucky Paper Radio is brought to you by that one annoying hole at FNM that just won't concede the match even though they've clearly lost. I don't know what they think's gonna happen. Maybe they're hoping someone will pull the fire alarm, or you'll somehow forget to win the game. Who knows? Anyway, you, buddy. Welcome to Lucky Paper Radio. I am your host, Andy, and I'm here as always with my co-host, Anthony. But we have another guest, Anthony, somebody I have spent all of my nickname equity on. We are joined by a third on this episode, and this is the god of gold cards, the genius of jank, the group hug cube thug, the chairman of the casual pod, our very own vociferous Vorthos, the man that once killed me with Metzali Tower of Triumph, and the Kineos and Tiro of my heart, Daniel. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, how are you? I'm so delighted that you had all those names for me.
They're pretty good, right? I spent
They're
some time
incredible.
coming up with those.
I forgot that
I'm happy to sacrifice my nickname equity.
Daniel,
I
welcome
forgot
to
so
the
many
show.
of those
We're very
things.
glad to have you.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Daniel, you're. I think my plan is for you to become our official Commander correspondent on this show. Anthony and I play Commander, but we're not as engaged with the format as we are with Cube. And so when we have Commander products that come out, if you're up for it, I'd love to have you join us on the show every time we have a Commander product come out, because you are deep in that Commander world.
It would be a delight. I really love the format. I've been playing for a long time, and it would be a joy to do that. I think that there's so much coming out, so much that has been out, and I have a lot of opinions on a lot of these new shiny cards.
Yeah, I think the best way to describe Daniel, maybe Anthony can weigh in here too. Daniel's the person that everybody wishes was in their Commander pod. Like, this is the person you want to play Commander with.
I'll back that up.
Oh, thank you.
He's fun, cool to hang out with, fun guy, cool decks. You're not trying to spike the pod. You got cool, fun decks that do fun things, and you're just delightful to be around.
I'm really grateful. Like, that's so kind of you to say. I really sometimes wonder if I'm doing enough to be a sort of like a genuine Magic player. Like, I didn't really play a lot of 1v1 Magic until I hung out with you guys. So I really just spent a lot of time figuring out if I wanted to, what kind of player do I want to be? Do I want to be a person that tries to spike a draft or stack someone out of a game or instant kill somebody? Or am I a person that wants to have fun with cards? And
I should give yourself some credit too, though. You're a pretty good limited player.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, a lot of
not
that is...
that you always win in the most traditional and expected ways, but you definitely can hold your own.
No, I definitely... The best game I ever played in Limited was in Theros Limited, where I chose the Pack 1, Pick 1, the Reincarnation Simic enchantment card. And I just cycled through a whole bunch of creature enchantments to get to better enchantments. And then I 3-0'd against Jay, who is noticeably better Magic player than I am.
Jay's better than all of us. The other person from our local play group mentioned pretty often on this podcast. So maybe someday we'll have to have Jay on so we can, fill out the whole lore that people are listening to.
I was going to say, I have been mentioned, in passing, a number of times on here. And I think that part of that is because I just have wackadoo things.
It's no coincidence, Daniel. It's no coincidence you've been mentioned on the show. You're a memorable guy.
Not wackadoo things. You have a valuable, different perspective.
Well, I hope to continue
It's a little
that
bit
today.
wackadoo.
It's a little bit wackadoo.
I was saying before Anthony hopped on the Zoom call, I think, Daniel, you have you're just one of the most intuitive players that I know. I feel like you play in a way where you can't always explain why you're doing what you're doing, but it tends to work out pretty well for you.
Yeah, the way that I typically evaluate cards is not by, you're going to hate me for saying this, I don't look at the mana cost when I look at things.
All right, click. Hang up on the Zoom call. So we obviously can't put all this fake news and misinformation out on our podcast. We have standards here, Daniel. We have a journalistic integrity. We can't just be telling people that the mana cost is irrelevant.
Count every pip. That's all I'm saying.
So on this episode, we are going to be, of course, talking about Commander Legends. That's why we have our Commander correspondent here with us. But also, we want to spend a little bit of time talking about Daniel's own cube, which is a little bit different, perhaps, than other cubes you might have played. And Daniel, I think we should just dive right into a pack one, pick one without necessarily explaining the cube right away to our listeners. Does that make sense to you?
Sure, I'd love to.
So as always, I'm going to read the pack, and if you are playing along at home, I recommend pausing the podcast, looking these cards up, so you can play the pack one, pick one game with us, because I think it is a very interesting cube with an interesting context in which to evaluate cards. So the pack is as follows: Muldrotha the Gravetide, Saltari Gorillas, Yortiller Nephilim, Shadow Mage Infiltrator, Golgari Findbroker, Tajik Legion's Edge, Treasury Thrall, Pure and Simple, Reaper of the Wilds, Farika's Mender, Vanefire Border Post, Paranoid Delusions, Venser the Sojourner, Mana Confluence, and Guild Mage's Forum. Now, everybody pause the podcast. Go look up these cards. I'll try and put a link in the show notes to this pack, and come back, and then we'll talk about what we're taking here. Dan, I'm going to leave you for the end because you are the authority on this environment. Anthony, you've played this cube before. What are you looking at from this pack?
This is a pretty tough pack. I think for me it's between Muldrotha, Tajik, and maybe Mana Confluence. I feel like the obvious choice here would be Mana Confluence if you're just looking at the pack, but for complicated reasons, I think it's actually less important than it looks. And I honestly just love drafting aggressive decks in this cube.
Damn, you stole my thunder, because I also love drafting aggressive decks. I would say that the cards in contention for me are also Tajik, also Mana Confluence. I'm going to put Pure and Simple in there too. Pure, I think, is really quite powerful here. So before we get to Daniel's cards he's looking at, I do want to clarify. Every card in this pack is gold, and indeed every card in this entire cube is gold. This is a gold cube. So for that reason, you might think that Anthony and I would be very keen to take a Mana Confluence pack one, pick one, because of course, why would you ever pass up excellent mana fixing in a gold cube? And it's definitely in contention for both of us, but there is a slight rules modification here, Daniel. And why don't you break the rules modification to our listeners?
Yeah, the reason that I have all these gold cards in the cube is because I wanted to have an all gold cube card. I really love multicolor cards in general, and I decided that we should create a cube that was inspired just by gold cards. Problem is that it's really hard to cast all gold cards.
Mana costs, the bane of Daniel's existence.
You know me. Hate a
How
high
dare
level.
these cards cost mana?
So, at the beginning of every game, each player begins the game with the Pillar of the Parents in play. It is a old school Ravnica gold card, and it says that you can tap it for any color mana that you want, but it can only be used to cast multicolor spells.
So everybody begins with the Pillar of the Parents in play. So not only do you get a 5-color land for free, though importantly a 5-color land that can't activate abilities based on Daniel's rules, but also you start a turn ahead. I mean, not a turn ahead of your opponent, just a turn ahead of what the normal understood curve of Magic is. Daniel, you go on in. What are the cards that you are looking at from this pack as a potential pack one, pick one? There's
a couple that I really like. The first one is Guild Mage's Forum. And the reason that I like that is because I know that there's a whole bunch of +1/+1 synergies within this cube. So having that extra counter on a creature when it enters the battlefield is really impactful in ways that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So that would typically be my first go-to. It also doesn't necessarily slot me into any specific deck or any specific type. So it keeps me open as things are going. The other thing that I was looking at is Venser, the Sojourner, primarily because of the +1 ability. The other two are pretty irrelevant. But the first ability says, exile target permanent that you own, return it to the battlefield under your control at the beginning of the next end step. And that has a lot of synergies with blinking creatures, enter the battlefield's creatures. If you get low on a planeswalker and you need to reset it, it's all really good. And I think that the third one in contention for me is Paranoid Delusions, which is blue-black. Target player mills 3 cards. But then it also has Cipher, so that if a creature that you control ciphered with this, or encoded with it, deals combat damage to a player, you get to cast that spell again.
Wow, have we ever had such a divisive pick?
Time to fight about it. Time to get a huge argument. No, so I mean, this I think does a good job highlighting the diversity of this environment. And I have to say, Daniel, when I was early to adopt Cube within our play group, and I started kind of evangelizing it to other people, you included, and you had like wondered out loud to me, I think at an F&M or something, or Wednesday Night Magic, you were like, I wonder if you can make a whole gold cube. And I was kind of pushing you like, yeah, do it. But I gotta be honest, I was pushing you in like a selfish way. I didn't really think an all gold cube would be that much fun. I just thought it'd be cool if you made it, and I just wanted more cubes in the play group, but I was just like, I don't know. Sounds like kind of not a great format. And then you were like, I'm going to give everybody a Pillar of the Parents, and I was like, that sounds kind of questionable. I don't know about that. And then the first time I actually played this cube, I was blown away by how fun it is, by how challenging it is, and by how interesting it is to radically recontextualize Magic cards just by making these 2 simple changes, or really the 1 simple change of starting with Pillar of the Parents, and then your design choice of only including gold cards, because this environment plays really fascinatingly and has a lot of replay value, I think. And one of the things that Anthony alluded to was playing aggro in this format, which is also my favorite thing to do here. Anthony, do you want to describe how an aggro deck is even possible in an environment where all of the cards are gold cards and we only get the 1 fixing land?
I mean, before even getting into that, I just think that this cube really, really highlights what I think is so awesome about Cube as a format that can really appeal to, every variety of Magic player. So as much as Daniel loves, sort of the emotional attachment to a lot of these cards and just the emotional response to gold cards in themselves, we can really also take our, like, spikier mentality to it and just try and solve this cube. And it is a really, really, really interesting puzzle to try and break down. So the weird tweak that I think it took us a little while, I think when we first started playing this cube, we all did a whole bunch of simulated drafts on Cube Cobra, and it took us all a few games to kind of figure out how it really works. And the thing is, if you just pick 2 colors, or even just 1 color, you can then draft cards that are just have a single pip off your main colors, and basically just ignore it, because you always have the Pillar of the Parents. There's intentionally no land destruction, so you're not going to worry about losing it. So if I take Tajik, it's not actually a gold card in the sense of a red-white card that I have to be both red and white. It's actually even the opposite. It's a hybrid card. I have to be at least white or red, but that's much more open than even just a monocolor would be in a normal draft. On the other hand, if we look at something like Muldrotha, even though it's a 3-color card, we can kind of just think of that as a 2-color card where we have to fit into one of those 3 color pairs that is in it. So because of the fact that you're starting a turn ahead, because you actually have a tremendous flexibility in terms of what you can actually draft and take, you can actually build a very efficient deck. And there's so many cool, like, lords that care about multiplayer cards or get a bonus and things like that it ends up coming together really well.
Yeah, so essentially you can draft a mono red deck. I have drafted mono red in this cube where I just take cards that are red and anything else, doesn't matter what anything is, and always use the pillar to play that off-color mana symbol, and then nothing but mountains in my deck full of all these gold cards. And it works very, very compellingly. And Daniel, I gotta say, it's a stroke of genius, I think, to basically take the gold cards, which, I mean, I think most people love playing gold cards, as in actually casting a gold card. For those of us that maybe are less enthusiastic about gold cards than Daniel is, I think our criticism is that they're so hard to draft. Sometimes you don't get the mana to cast them, and that feels bad. And so you've solved that problem in a way that, like Anthony said, makes all of these 2-colored cards into basically hybrid cards, which is actually a way more open draft environment than a normal Magic set. Because in this pack, we have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. We have 11 hybrid cards, 2 quote-unquote gold cards, and 2 lands that we're looking at here. So a very open draft environment, and another just a stroke of genius, like I said.
Yeah. So the other thing to know about this cube is that there's no colorless artifacts in there either. There's no real mana fixing.
Yeah, it's a gold cube, people. Yeah. Artifacts aren't gold.
There are not hybrid cards, so you're not going to have a Figure of Destiny. You're not going to have a Dovescape, because those are white and blue, but they're not gold bordered. Similarly, you're not going to have any lands that tap for 2 colors. You're only going to have lands that tap for either 3 or more, or Yeah, you'll have 3 or 4 or 5. So there really is. It's almost like eating the top of a cupcake first, right? It's just so much gold color everywhere that
Is there another way to eat a cupcake?
I don't think so, but I could be misled.
If you don't think aggro is viable here, let me just tell you, you haven't lived until you've played a turn 1 Dreadhorde Butcher into a turn 2, like, a Gruul Spellbreaker, which you can do in this environment pretty reliably, which is pretty great. So at the end of the day, what's your actual pick, Anthony? What are you taking?
It's really tough. And I'll also say that reading signals, even though we're describing this as actually a surprisingly open draft environment, reading signals is really, really hard. So I'm not going to sweat too much trying to stay open because I know I'm not going to be able to do a great job of it. Even though Muldrotha is a gold card, in the traditional sense of it's actually a multicolor card, it's really, really powerful in this environment. And unless you come up against an aggro deck, it's going to take over a lot of games. So I think I'm kind of leaning there, but it's very close.
I can see that.
I think you're right that Pure is basically a Vindicate that is very easy to cast, is a very strong card.
Yeah, Pure is great, because Pure, people probably do not know the card Pure and Simple. This is a split card from Dissension, I think. That's the Dissension set symbol. Mm-hmm. And really, you only care about the Pure side of it in this environment, and that's just one red-green for a sorcery. It says destroy target multicolored permanent, and listener, here, all of the permanents are multicolored. I guess maybe there could be some tokens somewhere that aren't multicolored that are created by gold cards, but for the most part, you just get to play Vindicate in an environment where you start with an extra land in play, which is pretty good. If I'm being real, I probably am still going to take Mana Confluence here. We talked about all the reasons why it's not anywhere near as high value as you might think it is at first blush. But in reality, none of these cards I'm like crazy thrilled about to start on. I mean, Tajik is kind of close. Pure is kind of close. But I think I'll start on Confluence and see if I can make any attempt at reading the signals, whether or not I'm going to play my my go-to aggro deck or trying to do something more controlling. So I'm going to start on Confluence. And then, Daniel, is it Guildmage's Forum for you or something else?
No, I think I would go with Venser. Venser, it's just good in a multitude of different scenarios. It starts pretty high and it's hard to kill. I think that Venser also then opens me up if there are other things that I need to deal with, that it gives me that opportunity to give creatures unblockable in a pinch. I think that the different ways that I could use this throughout a game makes it worth me picking a deck through it and around it.
I do want to call out Paranoid Delusions, which you mentioned, Daniel, as a card in consideration for you, only because I want to mention that one of my favorite drafts of this cube we ever did was where I put together the mill deck. And what was so striking to me about this deck is that, so you have both Glimpse the Unthinkable, which is the blue-black sorcery that says target player mills 10 cards. And then there's a gold card, which I can't find off the top of my head, which is almost exactly the same thing, right? Do you know what it is off the top of your head, Daniel?
Is it Breaking and Entering? Maybe? I don't remember. It's one of the fuse cards. It's the Grixis fuse card from the middle Ravnica set.
Yes, yeah, Breaking and Entering. You got it. You're a true encyclopedia.
My brain. Because, I have those cards, and I also have the Nemesis of Reason, which anytime it attacks, the defending player mills 10. And then there's a couple of things that I have in here that allow you to make use of things in other people's graveyards. So there really is a viable mill option. And unless you're directly in that form, you're really not being asked to... You're not looking for those cards for your deck in any other reason.
Yeah, I will say that the reason I thought this was such a cool archetype in your cube is that you really only have like kind of the 2 or maybe 3 dedicated mill cards in the entire cube. But the way I built my mill deck for this particular draft was, I ended up with the Breaking and Entering and with Glimpse the Unthinkable. Those are my only actual mill spells. And then I played, I think it was 4 or 5 different Archaeomancer effects that let me return instant sorcery from my graveyard to my hand. So my whole deck was just little creatures, removal spells, like kind of a control deck, creatures just to kind of block. And then I would just keep buying back one of the mill spells over and over again as my eventual inevitable win condition. And it was so striking to me that there was a whole archetype essentially that existed just because of the prevalence of these cards that bought cards back from your graveyard, which could be used to buy back anything, of course. They're very flexible cards that go in lots of strategies, but they turned just like 2 spells in my deck to like make my deck an entirely different strategy, which I thought was a very compelling archetype. So that's a very cool deck that is also draftable here, which I like a lot.
Yeah, one of the most prized cards I think in the whole cube is actually Warden of the Eye. It's a 2-pip Jeskai card from Tarkir. It's a Djinn wizard that says when it enters the battlefield, return target non-creature, non-land card from your graveyard to your hand. So it really opens up anything that you want to be doing with planeswalkers or, like you were saying, mill spells, removal spells, anything like that. It really has a lot of modality to it.
My favorite card to start on in this cube is just Kiora's Follower. Nothing like playing a 2/2 Bird of Paradise on turn 1. That feels real good to me.
Not Vine Mystic is also worth a mention.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, God. We do have to tell the story of the one time, Daniel, you actually literally cast Progenitus against me because this is a perfect example of how you see the game totally differently because we were drafting your cube and you were like showing me your deck before you played the games and I was like, Daniel, like, what have you done here? Like, you can't cast Progenitus. Like, why are you even playing this card in your deck? Like, it's a total joke. And you were like, yes, I can. Watch if I do this. You like have this whole string of things. You're like, if all of these things go right, I can cast Progenitus. And I was like, all right, buddy, whatever you want. I roll out of my head. And then, cut to round 2, and there I am staring down a not Vine Mystic and some way to untap it. And sure enough, you just cast Progenitus against me.
Yeah, I mean, it's a joy to behold. Because when else are you going to cast Progenitus in a limited game of Magic?
I mean,
when are you even going to do it in a Commander game, right? Like that's, I would say, just as hard, if not harder. But like in limited, it's almost impossible.
Yeah, I would guess the only times it's really been cast in limited are when it's under a Shell Dock Island. You get to cast it for free. But yeah, other than that, it's not a thing that typically happens. And boy, did I have egg on my face after I told you were silly for even putting it in the cube, and then I got dumpstered by it.
Ranch.
Classic Daniel. Classic Daniel shit right there. That is our Pack 1 Pick 1. If you want to have your cube featured on Lucky Paper Radio, email it to us at mail@luckypaper.co and include your name and pronouns, and we will put it on our spreadsheet to talk about on a future episode. Daniel, I want to talk a little more about the Gold Cube. Can you give us a little history of it and talk about your approach to it? And then you told me before we went on air that you were considering some changes you wanted some feedback on. So I'll just give you the floor.
Yeah. So just as a bit of a history about me as a player, I started playing when Kamigawa first came out 1,000 years ago. And I was really taken by legendary creatures. And then Ravnica came out, and I was like, these cards are gold and shiny and really cool. And seemingly restrictive, but I can figure it out. And so Ravnica was my favorite set of all time. And it has continued to be that up until this day. And it's really sort of spurred my love for gold cards. And so when I came to, it got me into Commander, it got me into like various like limited archetypes where I'm just going to choose all the gold cards and let the pieces fall where they may. I've done that to your cube multiple times.
I think we recounted the anecdote where you drafted what you, quote, told me was a Night Tribal.
Night Tribal? Oh, yes!
And I was like, Daniel, there is no Night Tribal in my cube. And you were like, yes, there is. Look, I have Knight of the Reliquary, and I have History of Benalia. And I'm like,
and then he continued to strip mine loop everybody.
Yes,
Night
Tribal. And then you 2-1'd with your Night Tribal deck that just strip mine locked everybody.
Yeah, it was a good day. It was a good day to be in Night. So yeah, when I was told about Cube as a format, I was like, that seems weird. You know what I mean? Because like, I was at the time not really known for drafting. I didn't like it so much. It cost money. It was a little like parasitic sometimes because you wanted all the best cards in the one color, and I much preferred Commander, which for me was a lot more of a soft format. Like you could just like be there and you could have a good time, and you're there for the social aspect of Magic and not necessarily the spiky victory of Magic.
Sure.
And then I played your cube a couple times. It's like, this is kind of cool. Like I'm playing cards that I would never get to play otherwise. I don't have a strip mine. I'm not going to get a strip mine. That's not something that I want to invest my time and energy getting. But I'll play yours. I'm happy to do that. And so when you suggested that I make a cube of my own, I was like, well, what defines me? What, as a Commander builder, would I find joy in building? And I looked at a whole bunch of cubes that were called gold cubes online, and I was like, there's like 100 artifacts. Like it.
I love the idea of you like putting you Google gold cube, or you look it up on Cube Tutor or Cube Cobra, and you're like, ugh, artifacts. Yuck.
Artifacts?
This is supposed to be a gold cube.
Yeah.
Putting it through your purity test.
So, like, so many signets, so many, and it makes sense in most of those formats because you don't have pillar of the parents in play. Like, you don't get that additional flexibility. You have to plan that in. So as I was building this, I was like, well, what if my 2 drops were 1 drops? What if my 3 drops were 2 drops? And so I just sort of mentally took a mana cost off of each of those cards when I was trying to figure it out. And that's sort of how the gold cube was thought of. I also decided early on that I wanted to have 2 legendary creatures in each color pair, and 1 planeswalker. And I figured that because it's pretty hard to construct a cube, and so I wanted to use the legendary creatures as signposts. So the people who like doing draft archetypes, they had that opportunity to like choose a legendary creature that they liked or that they thought would do well and build around that. So I didn't want people who weren't used to a draft format to get lost as they were trying to build a good deck.
That's really interesting. I think that's kind of cool how you've taken so much of what you enjoy about Commander and made it work in a limited environment while sort of being willing to take away some of the mechanical complexity of Commander itself. So it's like you still get to play with these awesome legendary creatures. You're still playing these wild games where people are hard casting Progeniti?
Progenitises.
But we can still just make it work like a simple draft thing, and it's as simple as just shuffling up the cube and dealing it out.
Yeah. I also I like, and maybe this is a function of me being a new cube designer, but I did fall into the mindset that each color pairing had to be represented equally, right? So I do have, I think it's exactly 25 of every color pairing except for Dimir. So everything it feels somewhat equal, so that you have an easier time trying to get your mana fixing like as you're building the deck to go well.
Well, hold on. What's wrong with Dimir, buddy?
No, I have more Dimir cards.
Oh, you have more. Okay.
And that is because I also wanted to support like an artifact dedicated deck. So there's a lot of Esper cards in there, and there's a lot of blue-white, black-blue artifacts in there, and that's actually one of the things that I'm looking into trying to support more robustly as I'm updating this cube.
So what kind of changes are you thinking about? I know you said you were planning some maybe sweeping changes to the cube. What's on your mind?
Well, there's starting with a land in play. That land becomes incredibly valuable. And I do have some cards in here, like Vindicate, that destroy any permanent. So if you target the pillars and you get rid of it in some way, then it really hampers the other deck to actually function.
Daniel, I hate to break it to you, but you do not have Vindicate in this cube list. I think we talked about this years ago, and you took it out because you were like, right, I don't want other people to kill those lands.
There are other things that do, like, Vindicate style things that I'm going to start weeding out, I think, as the weeks progress. And that's going to include the Genju of the Realms, which is a legendary, Wooburg creature enchantment that says that this spirit becomes an 8/12 with trample, and when it dies, it comes back to your hand. But if you put that on the pillar, then it gets destroyed, and you've lost the modality of most of your deck. It's not a great way to play, and I don't really like... I don't like having to think of different ways to keep the land on the battlefield. So I'm just going to probably remove most of the cards that deal with taking it away.
That seems fine to me. I mean, in that situation, obviously, I would expect that your player wouldn't put Genju on their most important land, but I'm never going to get in the way of you cutting actual 5-color cards, because even though we talked about all the ways that these cards are much more castable than you first expect, 5-color cards are still very hard to cast in this environment. Yes. So they don't get much easier with the help of the pillar. I mean, they become 4-color cards, which... it's kind of a rounding error, the difference between 4 and 5 color cards and how difficult they are to cast. It's a lot bigger than the difference, or a lot smaller than the difference, rather, between their 1 and 2 color cards.
Or 2 and 3 color.
Yeah, so that's the one thing that I'm looking at adjusting. The other thing that I'm looking at adjusting is more support for the Artifacts Matter deck. I've got somewhere between, I think it's 25 and 30 actual artifact cards in the cube, and some of them are like border posts, and some of them are things that other decks would really value getting. Unbended Time being one of them is one that you don't need to have in an artifact deck to make very, very powerful. So I've been looking at taking some other cards out and adding others in that support artifacts, and specifically artifact tokens, because there are actually surprisingly few gold cards that make artifact tokens.
Something I'm always struck by is, I guess it's probably changed now, but I remember when I first got into Magic, there was just surprisingly few gold cards, period, because, they haven't been around really since the beginning of the game, or haven't been well supported since the earliest days of the game, and they don't show up in every set in a very high density, and so there's just not as many gold cards as sometimes you might expect.
Yeah, you see gold cards on like signature creatures, legendary creatures in sets as they come out, and you see it in uncommon as, again, archetypes for draft. But outside of those two scenarios, and obviously places like Ravnica where that is the theme, you don't really get many gold cards added to the pile. Which actually, as a person who thrives on this restriction, it's really good to be able to look at new cards and sort of evaluate them as like, are these 10 cards, any 10 cards, better or worse than the stuff that I already have in my cube? And if they're not, then I don't have to worry about them, right? I don't have to go through and evaluate all the monocolor cards that come out because it's not applicable. It really makes it easier for me to sort of figure out if that's a card that I want or if it's a card that I can skip.
Yeah, that does make it nice to maintain the cube over time. You don't have to review every single card in every set to feel like you're keeping up with the cube, which I imagine is a nice benefit.
Yeah. And the other side to that, though, is that you get really disappointed that there aren't more gold cards because you do want to, I mean, one does. I don't know if you do specifically, but I get disappointed that there aren't more gold cards because I feel like they're pretty emblematic of, I'm just going to go ahead and say, like, they're emblematic of the lore of Magic. Two colors teaming up together to do one bigger effect. So a gold card, for me at least, is a more powerful card because of the restriction that it has to require 2 mana to cast it. So you have like a red 1 card and then a blue 1 card. Those are fine, but the idea is that if you can get a blue and red card together on like one piece of cardboard, then it's a much more powerful thing. And I would always rather play with that powerful thing.
Yeah, in exchange for the more limiting mana cost, which is, of course, your archenemy, you get a much more powerful card, which is your best friend.
I am going to be taking, like, it's in the pack one, pick one, but I am going to be taking out Your Tiller Nephilim. It just doesn't often have as much, it's often killed long before it's able to attack. And while there's a lot of stuff that puts things in the graveyard, it's not powerful enough at a 3-drop spot that I could warrant it staying. In its place, I'm actually going to put Brea, which is, I think, a much more powerful card, and it supports the Artifacts Matter deck, and it blinks with Venser, so you can keep getting the artifact tokens that you need to make that viable.
I think it's a great signpost for an Artifacts Matter theme. Brea is very powerful and probably worth the 3 colors that she puts you in.
So yeah, those are the major things that I've been looking at as far as the cube is concerned. I still have difficulty reconciling with the idea that all 10 pairings don't need to be equal. I still feel like you should have an equal showing of all the things that matter to the cube.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was interesting you said that was a drawback. I think we'll often say on the podcast that balance and perfect like equality of distribution of colors or distribution of lands or any kind of like system like that isn't critical. But I don't think our point is that it is bad. It's just that it can, sometimes people get caught up and it ends up being more of a distraction than is necessary.
A lot of people find it really helpful to force themselves basically to keep that in balance because it's a limitation. Every limitation breeds creativity. It will force you to look at cards that you wouldn't otherwise look at, and maybe you end up playing those cards and they turn out better than you thought because none of us are perfect at card evaluation. So I think it's a totally fine limitation if you want to stick with it, but you also shouldn't feel, I don't think, constrained by it. If you have a card you really want to put in and you can't find a cut in that color pair, then just cut something else. Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I'll take.
I'm just imagining Rakdos Doretti with Brea now, and oof, boy, it's gonna be. Yeah, that's the deck I want to draft next. I want to draft the Grixis or Dimir artifact deck.
Yeah, I'm really hoping that it's gonna be powerful. Again, like I need to have enough cards in there that matter for artifacts, but wouldn't matter for other decks. So it's a fine line between those two things. And I also kind of want, if nobody goes for the artifact deck, I still want the Seer of the Steel Winds or whatever it is, the huge Acroma in Esper. I want that to still be a great top end for a different deck if the artifact deck doesn't come together.
Yeah, it's tough balance. You mentioned that you were specifically trying to find cards other decks didn't want. Is that something you think about a lot when you're making adds or cuts, like intentionally excluding cards that are too generically good that every deck would want them?
I have difficulty with that. I do want there to be some cards that are much more potent in specific setups than in others. And I don't want everyone to have access to Electrolyze. Electrolyze is a great card, and it's a cantrip, deals 2 damage, and it's in Dimir. And I want the spells...
It's in Is It?
Oh, you're right. I did say Dimir. It's in Is It. And I do want decks to be able to play it, but I don't want every deck to think, oh, this is an auto-include. Because if everything's an auto-include, then you're only just picking the 23 best cards in the 360 card set.
Right.
And then Jay will just ranch on all of us again.
Has Jay actually played this cube?
I think he's played once. Played once. I think moreover the bane of the cubes that we've drafted have been the power of Nicol Bolas. He was in the deck when this first came out, and I took him out because it's just no form of Bolas is a fair form of Bolas.
I can confirm he was very tilting.
Yeah.
I also lost to Bolas, but sometimes Daryl casts a Nicol Bolas against you. You gotta just embrace it.
Yeah. Sometimes he casts a Nicol Bolas every time.
Every time.
That's also possible. I'm glad we got to highlight this cube because it's like I said, it is an example to me of both the potential variety of what cube can be. Daniel, you are a person whom I love, who has very different goals in Magic than I do. And it is inspiring to see you put together a format that so exemplifies what you love about the game. And I also think it's just a great example of how a very simple rules change. Like, there's no cognitive load to starting with a land in play, right? It's like all you do is just hand everybody a land and say, put this in play at the beginning of the game, and that's it. You don't have to remember a rules modification or anything. And that simple change just completely changes the way the format is drafted, and also then manifests your sort of goals. You want everyone to be able to play with cool gold cards, and therefore made it easier for everyone to do that. The fact that the cube works so well, and also, to Anthony's point, there's still plenty of room for me with my perspective on the game to have a ton of fun challenging myself to break the format and try and find the optimal strategy, and just not succeeded in doing so in, the dozen times I've drafted this cube. It's really inspiring to me for how great Magic is. The fact that you can do something you love and I can bring my own perspective to it and find something I love in that it's just what's great about Magic. And so this cube is a perfect example of that, I think.
Yeah, and I'm glad to have found that this is a format that exists too, right? Like, one of the reasons that I loved Commander so much was the building, the constructing of the deck, and finding the synergies and finding cards that you didn't know existed. For example, in this Pack 1 Pick 1, Sultari Gorillas, I didn't know that this was a card until I started looking at gold Boros cards. And this is a super old card that I didn't even know was a thing. And it seems really powerful. And I am just glad that it opened up this opportunity for me to delve further into the game that I love and find things that I didn't even know were things I could do.
Let's dive into Commander Legends then. This is a very new and unique product. This is the first time, I guess this is kind of it's a spiritual succession to the conspiracy products a little bit. This is a supplemental set that is not standard legal. It's going right to eternal format legality, that is designed to be drafted and also designed in this case to be played as Commander games, right? So I haven't actually looked. Do either of you know, are they suggesting you draft this in a pot of 4 people the same way you would draft Conspiracy? Is that the idea?
I think in a pot of 8 and then breaking into 4 pods is their ideal design, but also 4-player drafts being supported.
So it's a draft product, but then you play multiplayer Commander games with Commander or Commanders as you do in a regular Commander game. And I'm curious to know, again, Daniel, you're on this show for a reason. We care about your thoughts. So what are your first impressions of the new set?
I love it. I think it's great. There's a lot of value to be had for reprints. There's a lot of awesome splashy cards that only I would ever want to cast. There's a whole bunch of new commanders that give you options as far as not just draft, but like making commander decks that didn't exist before.
There is a lot of new commanders. A
Yes.
lot of them.
One of the things that they brought back for this is partner, which allows you to have two commanders at the same time as long as they both have partner. And there are cards that like value how many times you've cast your commanders, and each of those matters. So it makes it a cool experience trying to figure out which two pairings of the over 1,500 now will work best in a deck setup.
Yeah, it seems like that was kind of essential for them to do, given that they are having you draft the commanders for your commander deck. They would obviously... It would be a real bad situation to end up at the end of a draft and not have viable commanders for the colors you drafted. So the abundance of legendary creatures and the abundance of them with the partner mechanic basically allows you to always find whatever commanders you need for whatever deck you've drafted, which I think is kind of essential for a draftable commander product.
Yeah, I agree. I'm really excited to play some of these cards. They have brought back legendary planeswalkers that can be commanders. They have like really done a lot of lore payoffs for specific creatures that have been referenced either like in cards or had previous cards and are now getting a fresh coat of paint. It is really, really cool to see people who like the lore side of it, which is something that I really vibe with. It makes me really happy to see a new Sakashima or a Jessica or a Krark. I love it.
Krark was a very cool card. That was the card I
Yeah.
was maybe most excited to see in the set. It's a cool design, and that's a great example of the partner mechanic. So Krark, let's read it for everybody.
Krark says it's a 2-cost red spell. Krark the Thumbless. It's a 2/2 Goblin Wizard. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, flip a coin. If you lose the flip, return that spell to its owner's hand. If you win the flip, copy the spell, and you can choose new targets for that copy. And of course, it has partner. Every legend has a partner. Every monocolored legend has a partner in this set.
Yes, that's a great example of a mechanic that in a mono red commander deck would be fine, certainly, but I imagine pairing this with blue or possibly other colors could give you way more potential to abuse and have fun with that coin flip mechanic. I also really like that it's a coin flip mechanic that doesn't have a really bad outcome. Like, bouncing the spell back to your hand is not bad. In some decks, it actually could be a huge advantage. I looked at this and my first thought was, do I put this in my 5-color Jeskai Ascendancy deck? Because I think maybe I do. Because casting a spell and getting it returned to my hand, if it's a little cantrip and triggering Jeskai Ascendancy, is a very good spot to be.
Yeah, I would say that it's also really good when you're in a Spells Matter deck, when it's counting like a Storm setup. Even if it returns to your hand, then it's just another spell that you can cast again. So your Storm count would be 2 or 3 as opposed to just the 1 that it would otherwise be. So I think that
I love when
either
Daniel
way
talks
that
about storming off. It's great.
yeah, Storm for 3. That's great. It's the best.
What are some other cards you're really excited about, Daniel?
Draft-wise, I'm really excited for... Oh, the Courts. I'm super excited for the Monarchy mechanic to have a larger role in a draft format.
The court cycle are some of the cards that appear to be in consideration for a lot of cube designers as well, even people that are operating at the sort of peak of power level. Monarch is a great example of a mechanic that is designed for multiplayer. It's originally from Conspiracy, but it works just fine in 2-player. In fact, it works quite a bit better because you only need to protect the monarchy from a single player. So are you considering playing these in like I guess your cube's all gold, so you wouldn't consider putting them there. What do you think of Monarch as a mechanic in 1v1 games, Daniel?
I think that it's really powerful if you are an aggressive deck. I think that it's invaluable if your Boros are mono white or mono red. The ability to be able to stay up on cards as you're putting pressure on your opponent is quite potent. I think that I would value Monarchy a lot more highly in just about any like CMC 2 or less deck that I would have.
Anthony, what do you think about the Monarch mechanic?
You really want to loop me in about this format?
Yeah.
I mean, that's why we have Daniel on the show. We're going to talk about all the perspectives.
I think the Monarch mechanic is very cool in multiplayer. Obviously, being on the defense is very often in a multiplayer game just like naturally the better position to be in. So a mechanic that sort of forces you to attack and can sort of like create interesting political situations, I think is great for multiplayer. In 2-player, I'm really not crazy about it just because the player that is ahead gets more and more ahead, and I think it sort of leads to games that just sort of tilt one direction inevitably. It doesn't lead to the most interesting back and forth type gameplay.
Yeah, my response when I saw the courts, and there's a couple of other very strong cards in 1v1 that have monarchy on them, specifically Fall from Favor, which is the like claustrophobia effect that comes with the monarchy, is very strong. Azure Fleet Admiral, which is a 3/3 that's unblockable if you are not the monarch, which is very nice. When I saw those cards, the response that I had was, you know what? I'm going to cut Palace Jailer from my cube because I was looking at those cards and thinking, I really have no desire to play these in my own cube because of that exact effect Anthony just talked about. I think they have some of the highest ceilings and lowest floors of any cards you could imagine in a one-on-one environment. The high ceiling being that if you play them in a situation where you can protect the monarchy, any of these cards will, draw your next card every single turn and also have some powerful effect. And if you're in a situation where you can't protect the monarchy, it might be actively bad to play a card like this because you're just going to give your opponent a huge advantage. Now they're going to steal it from you, and now they're going to have this big advantage, then you're not going to get, the value of your own card you cast. So I had been on Palace Jailer for a long time because it is so potent. It is really, really strong. But I also am always trying to cut forests from my aggro decks, and the fact that all of these courts were immediately not interesting to me for that reason, I was like, you know what? Let's give it a Palace Jailer too. That's also got to go because it's in one-on-one, I think it's a mechanic that is not in line with my cube design goals.
Well, what do you think about Encore, the other mechanic that they came out with for this?
I think Encore is cool. That's it's basically in one-on-one, it's basically a copy of Unearth. And the difference in multiplayer is that you get a copy of that creature attacking every player. I like effects like that, especially a mechanic that basically gives your card in your graveyard some additional relevance is something I'm very high on. Flashback, still my all-time number one favorite mechanic. So that is appealing. I think looking at the Encore cards in the set, they were costed highly. They're all pretty highly costed, and that makes them, I think, much more appealing in a format like Commander or multiplayer game than it does in a one-on-one game. There just aren't any cheap, low CMC, efficient Encore cards that are piquing my interest.
Yeah, it does scale very nicely in multiplayer, which is why they have to cast it so much, or they have to charge it up so make the activation cost so high. I'm just thinking specifically about Kinsbale Courier, a 2/1 for 3 that enters the battlefield and gives a 1/1 counter to anything is not bad. It's not great, but the ability to be able to do it a second time later on in the game, I think is actually a very good kind of middle of the ground card that some maybe lower power cubes might be interested in.
I think the card's really cool. Honestly, I could see that having relevance in Pauper cubes because to your point, it's basically a 3-mana 3/2 with Unearth that has upside of potentially putting the counter on a creature that's more valuable to have a counter on. I like it. I could see that in Pauper and Peasant. I gotta say, none of us have Pauper or Peasant cubes, but I think one of my first thoughts about this set when I saw all the cards being spoiled is that I think Peasant and Pauper cubers are really getting hooked up in this set in a way that maybe typical vintage or legacy cubes are not getting as hooked up.
Yeah, the other card that I would call out for exactly that kind of situation is Benevolent Blessing. It is a card that has flash. It's an enchantment for 1 and a white. When it enters the battlefield, choose a color. Enchanted creature has protection from that chosen color. So it is sort of reminiscent of True Name Nemesis, but also works as a protection spell if something were to get Doombladed.
The cards that jumped out at me specifically for Peasant were, we saw Slaughter the Strong, which was a board wipe from Ixalan or Rivals of Ixalan, I can't remember which, got downshifted to uncommon, and we don't get a lot of uncommon board wipes, and so that was kind of interesting. And then Feast of Succession is another card that's been generating some buzz, because that is essentially a 6-mana Languish that gives you the Monarchy at sorcery speed at uncommon, which I think is another card that seems very good in Peasant Cubes if you're into the Monarchy.
Yeah, and that art is just incredible.
I do really like this Seb art on that particular one. It's very compelling.
I do want to talk about the gold commanders.
Let's do
they've come out with. So they did all 10 color pairings. Each of them has one at a gold and one at an uncommon. And then they each have a cycle of the tricolor legends as well. Now, these creatures don't have partner, so you don't have unlimited ways to get things done. But there's a couple of really interesting cards that have never really been seen in those colors before. I'm particularly excited about Gen, Arcanum Weaver, which is the Mardu 2/3 human wizard that sacrifices an enchantment and then returns an enchantment from the graveyard to the battlefield. I don't know how strong these cards will actually be in Limited, specifically in the set that they are being drafted, but I'm really excited to see what Commander decks come out with these cards.
Yeah, that seems like a very cool build-around Commander. I would be surprised if that would work reliably in the actual draft format, to your point, but definitely seems like it was printed to enable some cool, weird, synergistic Commander decks.
Anthony, do you like any of these? The gold commanders down here?
I think some of them are interesting. Definitely the idea of like Goblin Welder for enchantments definitely opens up a lot of possibilities. For me, the biggest issue is the fact that it is a 3-color card, and a lot of these other interesting abilities are as well. So it's going to be really difficult for me to find space for them in cubes. And, of course, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to find space in commander decks, where a lot of the commander decks that I have are actually monocolored for some reason. I think that's one of the things that
non-basic lands are expensive.
Yeah, it's not part of it.
I also don't like shuffling in Commander because the decks are too big. So monocolored Commanders are the way to go.
Except I play all the fetches I can in my monocolored Commander decks.
Well, that kind of negates both of the reasons I just gave, Anthony. So I gave you excuses and you've left them on the table.
I just gotta follow my heart when it comes to Commander, right?
That's the point of the format.
That's what I subscribe. Like I live by doing something with it. I like a commander that inspires me, right? Like that's why I build a commander deck. I like to be inspired by a card like, for example, Obeka, the Brute Chronologist that allows a player to end the turn as long as it's theirs. I just think that I don't know what I would do with it, but I think that the options that are afforded to me by having a 3-color commander like that are pretty high.
Sundial of the Infinite on a creature in the command zone is pretty cool.
Yeah, I like being able to be challenged by deck building like that.
I guess the bigger issue I have with these is, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to be the heel in this episode. Because of the sort of weird tension that the commander color identity introduces, they sort of either have the option of saying, we're going to design these cards as commanders and pack as many colors as we can so you can play a lot of different cards in the deck, or we're just going to say, well, this is a card that goes in the 99. And I much more enjoy that flexibility when you can say, well, this is going to be one card of a package that's going to go in my deck, than just saying, well, here's this really, really unique and specific ability. I'm just going to put this in the command zone, and the rest of my deck is all just going to be like sort of prescriptive, do the things that commander's about. So I'm a little bit less excited about that kind of design, card design for commander, than about these sort of like more open-ended, flexible, and multi-purpose cards.
I'll join you in the heel space a little bit and say that one thing I noted here of some of the gold cards that was actually confirmed to some degree by a question and answer with either Gavin or somebody else was that a lot of them feel like they are really bending the color pie, which I think is because they want to print a commander that has access to colors that maybe its mechanical effects on the actual card wouldn't put it in those colors. The one that jumps out of me is, I really like this card actually, the Turtle Shaman Archelos Lagoon Mystic, which it basically has what I would consider to be almost a mono white effect on it, and yet they put it in Sultai because it's way more interesting to have access to Sultai cards, I guess, than mono white cards. Obeka is another one that I don't quite get what's Grixis about ending the turn. Like, that effect on its own,
Just
like, it
feels
seems like
blue.
Well, it feels like blue and honestly a little bit like white to me. It seems like the most common way that effect will be used, absent other cards that can abuse it, is just you can at any point save somebody from dying. They're going to die, you tap your commander, and they choose to end their own turn, and whatever was going to kill them is no longer relevant, which is a kind of protection ability. So that's one thing I think is a side effect of a commander-focused set, is that there are different things that are brought to the forefront of the considerations of the designers that are working on the set, which honestly, one thing I'm actually kind of glad about is I'm kind of glad that this set is separated a little bit. But we see a lot of designs in regular standard expansions that seem like they're clearly, inspired by Commander. And R&D has said a bunch of times they want Magic products to be for lots of different players, and they're always trying to design things to get everyone interested. I'm actually, as a cube designer with really no cards in this set that are interesting to me, I don't think I'm going to test any of them in my own cube. I am totally fine to have a set that there's no cards for me to test in, given that it's a set that is so interesting to players that are not like me. And I think it's actually okay, and it doesn't bother me at all.
Yeah, I think I'll clarify my position a little bit and say that, I think they did a great job of designing the set for the players that enjoy this kind of gameplay and are looking for these kind of, specific build-arounds. And the set is overall not for me, especially because of the current state of the world. I will probably not end up playing the set at all. But that doesn't mean that they didn't do a great job for a different audience.
And that audience is Daniel. So back to positive stuff, Daniel. What else do you like about the set?
Not to heal as well, but
Oh no.
Uh-oh.
I know, it's the worst. But the fact is that all of these gold cards are legendary cards. So if I were to add any of these to my cube, I would have to sort of justify or evaluate its space within the reason that I have legendary creatures in there in the first place. So it is difficult for me to then put something like, Captain Vargas Wrath in my cube when there's not much in the way of, well, there's obviously no commanders in my cube. So that was a really bad example. But Hamza, the Elephant Warrior. Creatures get 1/1 counter buffs and then abilities for it. And so
you have 1/1 counter synergies in your cube. There's a lot of 1/1 counters going on.
I do, but I also utilize the Selesnya legendary creatures as signposts for tokens, which I guess this could also, but they don't do it as well as the two that I have in there now. When I'm looking at these cards, I'm seeing that I have 1 or 2 slots that I could put this in instead. And that's the restriction of me as the creator of the cube, and I could loosen that up a little bit, but I just didn't want it to be...
Loosen it. One more in each color pair. Do it. Let yourself do it.
If I were to put a card in my cube from the set, I think that I would put Gore Muldrak and Phenologist in there.
Why don't you read that card for us, for those that are not?
That is the Simic 3/2 Human Scout, legendary creature. You and permanents that you control have protection from salamanders.
Love it.
Good line of rules text already.
At the beginning of your end step, each player who controls the fewest creatures creates a 4/3 blue salamander warrior creature token. I think it's great. I think it's phenomenal. I think it's great if you're ahead on board, because they're going to get a creature that they can't do anything with, because they can't do damage to you. They can't block with it. They might have something that would be akin to an aristocrat's kind of setup, but for the most part, they would have to have planned ahead for that creature to exist. And on the other side, it's just straight up upside if you are able to get yourself a 4/3 at the end of every step that you have. And you can plan it out so that you could get those 4/3s on your side specifically.
That seems very good to me for the reasons you just said. I agree that very few decks in any one-on-one environment are going to be able to do much of anything with that 4/3 in your cube. I mean, it is a body, but like you said, can't deal damage to you, can't deal damage to any of your permanents, can't block. So I think the chance of it being 3 mana for a 3/2 and a 4/3 is very good.
Yeah, I'm really psyched about that card.
And the floor of it just being a 3/2 is fine. Now, Daniel, if you added that card, do you have Forbidden Orchard in your cube? I can pull up the listing and find out.
I do, yes.
There you go. That's a combo, baby. Every turn, give your opponent a 1/1 and give you a 4/3. I'll take that trade. What else, Daniel? Anything else you're very excited about this set? I have a subject I want us to end on, but if you got anything else before we go there,
I do want to take a moment. I do want to take a moment and sort of address the Jeweled Lotus in the room.
This was where I was going to end. So,
oh, for real?
We have to weigh in, I think, on Jeweled Lotus because it is perhaps the most talked about Magic card in recent memory. I mean, it's hard to say because there've been so many cards that have been talked about a lot, but this card feels like it really generated quite a stir in the Magic world. So Daniel, where do you come down on this one?
I think it's stupid. I think that a 3-mana one-time artifact that gets your commander out one time, even if it's in advance of the rest of the board state, I think that puts such a huge target on your back that it would be hard for you to get back from that situation. Commander is all about politics, and it's all about gameplay, and it's all about interacting with not just your enemies, but the enemies of your enemies. And if you turn 1, Plains, Jeweled Lotus, Grand Arbiter, you're not going to have any friends for the rest of the game the first turn that you play.
Isn't Grand Arbiter white, blue, blue, or is it just 2 blue, white?
It's 2 blue, white.
Okay.
So, like, you make no friends by having this Jeweled Lotus, and then your people who are going to play that are either going to choose to not play with you for the second round, or 100% remember
forever
that you played this during the second round, right? So I feel like the momentary upside of having the Jeweled Lotus out to be able to cast your commander super fast and end the game really quickly pales in comparison to actually playing the game.
Anthony, Jeweled Lotus, what's your verdict?
I don't want to claim that it is in any way objectively good or bad. What I will say is that I think it is extremely high variance, and more so than I'm looking for and would enjoy in a game of Commander.
I'm Anthony. I'm not going to give my opinion. I'm just going to observe a fact about the card, which is that it's high variance. Here's my hot take. I think Jeweled Lotus is cool, and I think it makes total sense for what Commander is. This is a format where Soul Ring and Mana Crypt are legal, so I don't think it's out of place to have this card in existence. There's already a lot of high variance cards in 100-card Singleton. I think it's interesting that I totally understand your criticisms, Daniel, which are very similar to other criticisms I've read of other Commander players, which is that for those people that are, maybe pushing the power limits or trying to optimize Commander a little bit, this is a card that's just a slam in every single deck, and it just decreases the variance of the meta and just kind of introduces a new must-play card alongside all of the other must-play cards that are legal in the format, which, totally true. I saw a lot of people saying that this is not something we asked for, right? Like, no one wanted this card. And what I'll say is that I think, some people really did want this card. I don't think it was at the front page of the subreddit for a whole week because everybody hated it. I think it was there because some people thought it was very cool and really wanted it. And I also, more importantly, want to point out that cards like this are an inevitable byproduct of products like Commander Legends. If you want Wizards R&D to design and print cards meant for your format, every once in a while there's going to be a big power outlier, which is meant for your format and is very powerful and everyone wants to play. And that's kind of just something I think you have to accept, because for all the players out there that say that they don't like this card and never asked for it, and the card they're most excited about is the one that makes, Salamander tokens, there is a bunch of other players that are thrilled about this Jeweled Lotus and would never dream of making a Salamander token in their entire life. So, yeah, I don't know. I think it's cool. I think Commander, to me, is kind of about doing swingy stuff, and you've already got Mana Crypt and Dark Ritual and Soul Ring, so this doesn't feel so out of bounds for me.
Yeah, I feel like you're on the money there. Obviously, this is an incredibly powerful piece for competitive EDH. EDH, I think, is going to want this a lot more because they want to build a deck that wins fast, right? And I can respect that, but never play it because the winning fast of Commander is not what drives joy for me. And while this art certainly sparks joy, and I really like the flavor text, I don't think that I would ever actively, even if I was handed this card, I don't think I would put it in any of my decks.
You notoriously don't run Soul Ring in lots of your decks too, Daniel.
None of my Commander decks have Soul Ring in them.
You're putting your foot down. You're sending a message.
Well, the thing is that, if everybody plays it, then what's unique about it? Right? Why not just have it be the Pillar of the Parents in play?
Everyone should start with Soul Ring in play.
I do very much like, however, that they reprinted some other things that are getting less attention and notice than Jeweled Lotus. I really wish that they had. I don't know. I don't want to say I don't wish that they printed Jeweled Lotus because that is something that I can't undo or fix. But I don't know. It took away from some of the other really, really cool cards that they put in this set, because this was, again, like you were saying, Andy, like anybody that was going to draft this was talking about this for the entire first week that it was released.
everyone's got a take on it, but it's a powerful card. I understand why.
I mean, it really brings up the core challenge of Commander, and really any casual format, where to optimize the format is not always what's actually fun. So I totally enjoy sitting down with people that I know and I understand the power level of their decks and playing a couple games of Commander.
Like Daniel.
Absolutely like Daniel. But the more cards like this that they print that really, really push the power level, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not mad about it. They should do what serves them as a game design company. But it does mean I'm a little bit less inclined to go to a shop and just sit down and try and play a Commander game with, random strangers. Because I've definitely had that experience many times where you sit down, somebody does a turn one combo, and you're like, okay, well, what was the point of this? And
the point was for them to assert dominance, and you got asserted upon.
But on the other hand, I think that's what's really cool about this format is that it is a limited format, so you can have that experience of like these wacky high variance plays, but you can still try and optimize it, and optimizing it can also be the fun thing.
Yeah, I struggle with that same thing you just said, Anthony, which is that I do think that Commander as a format is a format that rewards you for not optimizing. I think what is interesting and novel about the format is the weird janky decks you can build that take advantage of old cards that are otherwise unplayable. And CEDH is totally fine. I actually follow the CEDH meta somewhat closely because I think it's interesting, but it really is just like vintage light with a few changes, right? I do think the spirit of Commander is taking advantage of all these other more janky cards. And so we've talked before about, Mark Rosewater's find the fun. Make sure you make the fun thing also the way that you win the game, the way you succeed in whatever game you're creating. And there is a tension, I think, in Commander where, everyone reaches a point in their play group where their deck gets a little too good and no one wants to play with them anymore. And you're like, well, geez, I was just trying to, play a game and optimize my choices and do the best I could. And you this weird kind of tension there, which that's why I don't go to shops and play with randoms, that and the global pandemic. But that's why we have Daniel. We can play with Daniel whenever we want.
Two pretty good reasons. I'd say of similar value.
Yeah, exactly. Similar weight. The global pandemic and randoms at a LGS that will get mad if you have a counterspell. Shall we wrap it up there, boys?
I think so. I think that's a good place to stop. There's a bunch of reprints that if you are looking at them, that you're super excited to see. And the dual lands that reward multiplayer plays. I'm really excited to see them finish that set off too. Yeah, I'm very pleased with this. Jeweled Lotus notwithstanding.
I'm just hoping that the Iconic Masters foil Prince of Mana Drain decrease sharply in price. We will see. So far, not so much, but I think it might once the cards actually start circulating. This has been Lucky Paper Radio. A big thank you to Daniel for joining us. Thank you, Daniel, for taking some time out of your rainy Wednesday and setting up a recording setup and talking to us about Magic. I really appreciate it.
It is a joy and a delight. I love to talk about my favorite game, and you guys make it incredibly fun, and I appreciate the way that I view it and the way that I play, because it's certainly not optimal, but it is delightful. And
Daniel, the way you play optimizes for fun, and that's what I want Magic to be for all people. I wish for everybody out there that you can have a Daniel in your life to play casual EDH with, because it is one of the best ways to play Magic, truly. Is there anything you want to tell people about, Daniel? Do you want to point people anywhere? I'm going to make you move your cube over to Cube Cobra. I'll put a link in the show notes, but is there anything else you want people to look at?
Yeah, check me out on Cube Cobra.
Follow the Gold Cube over there for updates on the latest cool gold cards. We had some technical issues with the Commander of Legends survey last week, so if you went to try and find it after last week's episode, you might have failed to. But fingers crossed, knock on wood, we will have the survey out by this episode, so please go check out that survey. And if you're testing any of these cards in your cube, no matter what your cube looks like, we want to hear from you and have you fill out that survey. So check that out at luckypaper.co/survey/CMR. The link will also be in the show notes, and we will have a compiled data visualization and analysis of those survey results for you in a couple weeks' time, so we can talk about how the set has landed with various players. That's it for Lucky Paper Radio. Thank you all out there in Radio Land for listening, and thank you, Daniel and Anthony, for talking about Magic with me.
Right.
Correct.
Daniel's making fun of you, I think, Anthony.
I'm very much making fun of you, Anthony.